This is the WTF Bach podcast. The podcast about Johann Sebastian Bach, brought to you by his prodigal son, WTF Bach. Join WTF Bach as he guides your mind through a contrapuntal journey. Why don't you let WTF Bach guide you? And now, here's WTF Bach.
It's Seven Shinners here, WTF Bach. A few episodes ago I mentioned that we'd take a look at Bach's critics during his own lifetime, who was out and about saying, this Johann guy, he's not all that. And this came on the heels of the releases of my new albums. I wish I could just not read the reviews and carry on, but I do admittedly Google myself 4 to 7 times a day. Now, most reviews of any work they're sort of bland. We all wish for the harsh reviews of old, but instead most reviews are filled with sentences like, his sensibility is akin to Gould's, but his poetic sympathy is not quite as forced as Angela Hewitt's. And so sort of like, what does that mean? So keeping in mind the quote attributed to Johannes Kepler, I prefer the sharpest criticism of a single intelligent man to the thoughtless approval of the masses. I'd like to turn our study today to Bach's own critics in his lifetime. And if you're familiar with Bach's biography, you know that he had this one famous dissenter named Johann Adolf Scheibe, Scheibe. Scheibe. Now, Mr. Scheibe was the son of an organ builder. Bach actually tested several of his father's organs. Scheibe grew up in Leipzig. Bach must have passed him in the hallways and the alleys many times. He went to Nikolai Schule. He's about 23 years Bach's junior, so Bach may have been a rather looming figure in Scheibe's young life. Here's a brief sentence from his biography. He began studying law and philosophy at the University of Leipzig in 1725, and in the course of his studies he encountered the professor of rhetoric and poetry, Johann Christoph Gottsched, whose aesthetic theories deeply influenced Scheibe. Gottsched's writings, which were primarily targeted toward the reform of German poetry and drama, greatly informed Scheibe's formulation of his philosophy of music. Due to financial difficulties, Scheibe was unable to finish his university studies and devoted himself instead to a largely self-taught career in music. So this Scheibe, he's no slouch. He's an intellectual, he's learned. Bach is friendly with his father and possibly him. And here's where the story starts. Scheibe applies for the role of organist at Thomaskirche in Leipzig. That's Bach's church. And Bach had been one of the judges who, rejected him. It's not a cold-hearted rejection, however, because soon after Bach writes a letter of recommendation on Scheibe's behalf, who's now applying for the organist position in Freiburg. So you've got a letter of recommendation from Bach. That is where most people's CVs would begin and end. Let's see what Bach has to say about Scheibe. He says, whereas the bearer, Mr. Johann Adolf Scheibe, LL Studiosus and most zealous student of music, has requested me, the undersigned, to give him a testimony concerning his knowledge in musicus. Now, therefore, I have been glad to do so, and at the same time to testify that he is thoroughly at home not only on the clavier and violin, but also in composition, and accordingly I do not doubt that he will be in a position adequately to attend to whatever office God may assign him. Joch Sabast Bach, Kapellmeister to the Prince of Saxon, Wissenfeld's Director Chori Musics Leipzig, April 4th, 1731. That is part of Scheibe's application for the organ position at Freiburg, and he doesn't get the job there either. So Scheibe leaves Leipzig in 1735. He's still a young man, and he ends up in Hamburg, where he becomes friends with Georg Philipp Telemann and Johann Mattheson, both very important people in the world of Bach studies and the world of Baroque music in Germany. And with both their encouragement, Scheibe publishes this magazine called Der Kritische Musikus from 1737 to 1740. And this magazine has widespread readership. It remains important for its discussion of its significant contemporary composers, but it was there, in the 6th publication of this magazine, that Scheibe earned his real infamy when he dared attack Bach. And it was perhaps the rejection in Leipzig, or Bach's recommendation letter didn't win over the Freiburg people either, or maybe it was just his desire to say something controversial for the sake of selling more magazines. It's hard to say. I think we can say, however, that we will find Scheibe immediately regretful. Firstly, his criticism begins with lavish praise of Bach, but then it goes on, as may have been the opinion of many, we might keep in mind. It goes on to essentially say that Bach's style is too detailed, too complicated. And this is in 1737, mind you, only a few decades before Mozart, for example. But I think the real thing that sparked this controversy is that Scheibe doesn't sign his name, and he also doesn't mention Bach's name, so it's a somewhat cowardly criticism. And after this hits the shelves, well then, it hits the fan, and the Bach defenders come out of the woodwork to just destroy Scheibe. And I say, Scheibe is probably regretful. He writes a few positive things after this whole controversy. He calls, for example, Bach's Italian concerto, quote, the perfect model of a well-designed solo concerto. And sadly, and maybe unjustly, Scheibe goes down in the history as the one who dared attack Bach. He even ends up in the first biography of Bach by Forkel for this. This is from Forkel's biography. Partly the office which John Sebastian filled, partly also the great reputation which he enjoyed for art and knowledge, caused him to be often requested to examine young candidates for places as organists, and also to give his opinions of new organs. He proceeded in both cases with so much conscientiousness and impartiality that he seldom added to the number of his friends by it. The late Danish Kapellmeister Scheibe once, in his younger years, submitted to his examination on an occasion when an organist was to be selected for a post, but found his decision so unjust that he afterwards, in his Critical Musician, sought to revenge himself by a violent attack on the former judge. That's Scheibe's place in music. So let's read this famous Scheibe criticism.
Let the prodigal son, WTF Bach, guide your mind. Who do you want to guide your mind? Maybe WTF Bach while he talks about Johann Sebastian Bach? Hello, and welcome to the WTF Bach podcast.
This can all be found in the new Bach Reader. This is number 343. May 14th, 1737, Scheibe writes, finally, Mr. Blank is the most eminent of all the Musikanten in blank. He is an extraordinary artist on the clavier and organ, and he has until now encountered only one person with whom he can dispute the palm of superiority. I have heard this great man play on various occasions. One is amazed at his ability, and one can hardly conceive how it is possible for him to achieve such agility with his fingers and with his feet in the crossings, extensions, and extreme jumps that he manages without mixing in a single wrong tone or displacing his body by any violent movement. This man would be the admiration of whole nations if he had more amenity, if he did not take away the natural element in his pieces by giving them a turgid and confused style, and if he did not darken their beauty by an excess of art. Since he judges according to his own fingers, his pieces are extremely difficult to play, for he demands that singers and instrumentalists should be able to do with their throats and instruments whatever he can play on the clavier. But this is impossible. Every ornament, every little grace, and everything that one thinks as belonging to the method of playing, he expresses completely in notes, and this not only takes away from his pieces the beauty of harmony, but completely covers the melody throughout. All the voices must work with each other and be of equal difficulty, and none of them can be recognized as the principal voice. In short, he is in music what Mr. von Lohenstein was in poetry. Turgidity has led them both from the natural to the artificial, and from the lofty to the somber. And in both one admires the onerous labor and uncommon effort, which, however, are vainly employed, since they conflict with nature. Now, this is unsigned, like I said, which is possibly one of the reasons that this really did not go well. 29-year-old Scheibe writes this in the magazine, and a lot of the controversy here will revolve around this use of the word Musikanten, right? So Scheibe said, Mr. Blank is the most eminent of the Musikanten in blank. Now, Musikanten originally used to just designate any single musician, but then took on a derogatory connotation. At this time, 1737, it had begun to assume the meaning of a mere practical and somewhat humble musician, like fiddler, as opposed to violinist. A little bit from Christoph Wolff, who writes on this topic. Let me quote from an article published in 1737. Mr. Blank is the most eminent of the musikanten in blank. So begins an unsigned controversial piece of music journalism in the new, fashionable, and deliberately progressive periodical Der Kritische Musikus. At that time, any informed and vigilant reader could have filled in the blanks in the first line, especially after reading what followed. The editor of the pamphlet and also the author's article, a 29-year-old upstart named Johann Adolf Scheibe, was fully aware of that. Moreover, he knew that the terms eminent and musikant hardly fit together, and combining them so ambivalently would add insult to injury rather than express any muted reverential gesture toward Mr. Bach in Leipzig, the implied subject. Of the numerous critical points that reflected Scheibe's aesthetic preferences and general orientation, and constituted one of the most vitriolic yet ultimately inconsequential pieces of early music criticism, what offended Bach the most was his being referred to and labeled as a musikant, a music maker, a mere practitioner. His frame of mind becomes evident in the published response written on Bach's behalf by Johann Abraham Birnbaum, a faculty member of Leipzig University. In defending Bach, who was undoubtedly enraged by Scheibe's assault, Birnbaum also takes issue with the utterly inappropriate application of the term musikant. And now we have Birnbaum's refutation. Now, Wolff says that Birnbaum is Bach's ghostwriter, that Bach is fully aware of this and behind this. So this might be one of the few times that we have, even though it's not by Bach, some writing about his art reflected at least through a ghostwriter of Bach. It begins actually with an elaborate dedication, as many of the dedications in the Baroque do, to the most honored Sir Mr. Johann Sebastian Bach, royally appointed court composer and Kapellmeister to His Royal Majesty in Poland and Serene Electoral Highness in Saxony, as well as director of music and cantor at the St. Thomas School in Leipzig. The author dedicates with great devotion these pages concerning him. And then he quotes Horace. He actually quotes the epistles of Horace. Quid verum atque decens curo et rogo et omnis in hoc sum. The search of truth and decency hath filled my breast, hath every thought and faculty possessed. And then he goes on and dedicates at least a page to sort of the ideas of perfection and imperfection and praise and blame being present in every single human. I'm going to briefly go through this first page. The person is still to be born who will have the quite exceptional good fortune to please everyone, for it is not to be denied. We should wait in vain in a world of which imperfection is all too characteristic for a man who, as the embodiment of all perfections, would be worthy to receive the approval of everyone. Praise and blame are the usual judgments of men who have both elements before them. And if both are to be weighed by justice, truth above all should speak for them. Now, daily experience teaches that both praise and blame are the most dangerous stones over which the judgments of most people stumble. Little reflection will be needed in order to discover more than one reason for this. Sometimes it is a lack of deep insight into the matters to be praised or blamed. Things are judged by people who do not understand them. At times one is blinded by too partisan emotions. Such a judgment always does violence to truth. Often one is misled by the general opinion. One speaks then more in accordance with the opinion of others than from one's own conviction. Thus it cannot be otherwise. People and things of quite exceptional qualities are deprived of the value that properly attaches to them. Okay, so if the dedication to Bach and the quote from Horace weren't enough to set the tone, this passage, which I skimmed and only read little bits of, should be enough to give you the impression like this is a person who is not going to throw out an opinion without considering what it means to express an opinion, right? That sounds very Bachian indeed. He goes on to say, such approximately were the thoughts that crossed my mind when the sixth part of the Kritische Musikus came to my eyes. I read therein a letter that contained both praise and blame for persons, some of whom are really the most eminent masters in Germany and Saxony, and some who want to pass for such. Ooh, okay, the first, the gloves are off, now they're duking. Since the writer does not give his name, although he utters his opinions pretty freely on one thing and another, a certain curiosity was aroused in me to inquire a little more closely into who the author of this letter might be. I believed that the knowledge about the identity of a person who lays his opinions before the world would lead to a more accurate investigation of his abilities and his insight into what he was judging, and that this would provide an opportunity the better to test the value of the opinions themselves. So I love that this is where it begins. This person who doesn't even put his name on the report what are his credentials? Who erected a statue to this critic, right? No one ever erects a statue to this critic, said, I can't remember who said that. I should make that the episode title, No One Ever Erected a Statue to a Critic. But it goes on. In fact, this defense is some 12 pages long, because after this, when Birnbaum says, okay, who is this person anyhow, and what are their credentials? He quotes Scheibe's criticism in full, and then he dissects it line by line. It's actually very painful reading, to be quite honest, so I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to give you a taste here. Because it was really this term Musikant that set Birnbaum and Bach off. The honorable court composer is called the most eminent of the Musikanten in Leipzig. This expression smacks too strongly of the mean and low, and does not fit the titles extraordinary artist, great man, the admiration of whole nations, which are applied to the honorable court composer in what follows. The term Musikanten is generally used for those whose principal achievement is a form of mere musical practice. They are employed for the purpose, indeed they often devote themselves voluntarily to it, of bringing pieces written by others into sound by means of musical instruments. Right, now that's just slightly important for us in the 21st century to keep in mind, that here is someone saying in 1737, someone who brings pieces written by others into sound by musical instruments is somewhat low in the ranks of musicians, but let us lay that aside and go on. As a matter of fact, not even all the men of this sort, but only the humblest and meanest of them usually bear this name. There is hardly any difference between Musikanten and beer fiddlers. If one of those musical practici is an extraordinary artist on an instrument, he is not called a Musikant, but a virtuoso, and least of all does this disdainful name apply to the great composers and those who have to conduct choruses. Now let the reasonable reader himself decide whether the praise that is due to the honorable court composer can be fully expressed by calling him the most eminent of Musikanten. So as Wolf said in his essay, any reader would have understood that the most eminent of Musikanten is a very backhanded compliment. Now, I'm skipping again because, as I said, it's sort of a painful defense to read, but I particularly like this part. The author writes further that the honorable court composer has until now encountered only one person with whom he can dispute the palm of superiority. Just who may be meant by this is unknown to me, as well as to many others. The author would have put many people under obligation and could have satisfied their justifiable curiosity if he had given more precise information about this man, but I doubt whether he will be in a position ever to do so. If he's aiming at a certain great master of music in a foreign realm who, it is said, has, in accordance with the usage of his country, received the dignity of a doctorate in music because of his quite special ability, I will invoke the testimony of some impartial connoisseurs of music who on their journeys have also had the good fortune of hearing this great man and have praised his ability uncommonly, but nevertheless have frankly stated that there was only one Bach in the world, and no one could equal him. Accordingly, it might be said that the honorable court composer has still encountered no one with whom he could dispute the palm of superiority. Then he goes on to talk about the praise, actually, that was laid upon Bach by Scheibe. He says, he admires the uncommon agility of his hands and feet. He considers it inconceivable that it is possible in the fastest and most violent movements of both hand and feet, and with such wide jumps not to, quote, mix in a single wrong tone or to displace the body. Now, all of this is just and correct, yet such a judgment would also have been pronounced by a man who did not have a thorough knowledge of music. But since the author wishes to be regarded as a man whose judgment is far above the common taste, it seems to me very curious that he did not mention, in addition, circumstances that are far more important than this. And this, I really love this. So he's saying, even in the compliments, he didn't really go so far into the compliments, right? He's only commenting the fact that the feet move quickly, there are no mistakes, but he doesn't go, quote, far more important than this, circumstances that could easily strike a real connoisseur of true musical perfections. Why does he not praise the astonishing mass of unusual and well-developed ideas, the developments of a single subject through the keys with the most agreeable variations, that the quite special adroitness, even at the greatest speed, in bringing out all the tones clearly and with uninterrupted evenness, the uncommon fluency with which he plays in the most difficult keys just as quickly and accurately as in the simplest, and in general an amenity that is everywhere joined with art, to discuss such remarkable perfections which indisputably belong to the honorable court composer alone, and to emphasize them as they deserve, would have been better worth the author's trouble. That there is just wonderful for us to think about. You know, Bach could play in the most difficult of keys as quickly and as fluently as in the most simple of keys. Okay, but now after attacking Scheibe's compliments, he begins to attack Scheibe's attacks. Quote, he reproaches Bach's pieces, to begin with a lack of amenity, that is, melody without dissonances, or as others say who have no better understanding of the matter, quote, because they do not please the ear. Now, to refute this accusation, a noteworthy passage in the English Spectator would suffice almost by itself. So I love this. Birnbaum quoting something somewhat contemporary in English. The passage reads, music is not designed to please only chromatic ears, but all that are capable of distinguishing harsh from disagreeable notes. That is, those who know how to introduce a dissonance skillfully and resolve it adroitly. The true amenity of music consists in the connection and alteration of consonances and dissonances without hurt to the harmony. The nature of music demands this. The various passions, especially the dark ones, cannot be expressed with fidelity to nature without this alternation. One would be doing violence to the everywhere accepted rules of composition if one wished to slight it. Indeed, the well-founded opinion of a musical ear that does not follow the vulgar taste values such alteration and rejects, on the other hand, the insipid little ditties that consist of nothing but consonances as something of which one very soon becomes tired. How carefully the honored court composer sees this alteration and how poignantly pleasing this harmony is clearly to be seen from his pieces. And this is confirmed by the complete approval of those whose musical hearing is not spoiled by I know not what newfangled taste. Okay, I think that sort of stands on its own, but I just want to read that again. The true amenity of music consists in the connection and alteration of consonances and dissonances without hurt to the harmony. The nature of music demands this. The various passions, especially the dark ones, cannot be expressed with fidelity to nature without this alternation. One would be doing violence to the everywhere accepted rules of composition if one wished to slight it. Now, things that are coming to mind, say, for example, the 25th variation of the Goldberg variations, you know, the Black Pearl, as I think von der Lindowska called it. It is really a true alternation of consonances and dissonances, and that is a dark one. You know, the various passions, especially a dark one. I love that. I'm skipping over several pages as I've been doing because it's very long, but let's go to the criticism of what Scheibe said about how it's very difficult for the singers to sing. He cuts their throats, or whatever Scheibe said. Up to this point, the author has attempted to make Bach's works repulsive to delicate ears. He now sets out to issue a warning against them to the rest-loving fingers of instrumentalists and the throats of singers which have been spoiled over a long period. Okay, I love this. To the rest-loving fingers of instrumentalists and to the throats of singers who have been spoiled over a long period. He represents them as being very difficult to play, since the honored court composer, in writing them, quote, judged only according to his own fingers. He accordingly considers the demand that singers and instrumentalists should be able to do with their throats, and instrumentalists whatever he can play on the clavier, as impossible. Now, I grant that the pieces written by the honored court composer are very difficult to play, but only for those who are not willing to train their fingers to the fluent motion and correct fingering. Incidentally, he is not unjust when, in writing these pieces, he judges according to his own fingers. His reasoning can only be as follows: for that which I have achieved by industry and practice, anyone else with tolerable natural gift and ability can also achieve. And for this very reason, the alleged impossibility falls to the ground. One can do anything if one only really wishes to, and if one industriously strives to convert natural abilities by untiring zeal into finished skills. If it is not impossible for the honored court composer to play pieces on the clavier with two hands perfectly and without the least air, in which both principal and inner voices have their proper share of work, how should it be impossible for a whole chorus consisting of so many persons, each of whom has to pay attention only to one part? So there is that famous quote, attributed, I think actually correctly attributed to Bach, where he says, "I was obliged to be industrious, and anyone who is equally industrious will succeed equally well." Bach obviously really believes this. I mean, in that passage there, he says, anyone else with a tolerable natural gift and ability can also achieve. So he says that he worked by untiring zeal is how Bach worked. It's very inspiring that this is how Bach sees himself, or at least how Birnbaum sees Bach, that he was a person of a tolerable natural gift and ability, but really it was the untiring zeal that made him Bach. I mean, that should be inspiring to us, at least.
Join Evan's Substack, the only place for you to find all things in the mind of Evan Shinners. wtfbach.substack.com.
Now, I've been reading to you for over 25 minutes now. I hope you're still with me. I've been skimming over a lot because it would probably take a whole hour to read this rebuttal by Birnbaum. He says things like, well, what does confused mean? What does turgid mean? At least let's settle upon a definition of confused in music, but let's be content to leave the defense by Birnbaum there. If you want me to email you the entire criticism and defense, send me an email at bach@wtfbach.com, and I will send you all these documents so you can read the entire thing in full. I find them very entertaining. Now, Scheibe does not back off at this point. In fact, he doubles down. 18th of February, 1738, and he says, "I'm not at all put out about an essay recently issued in Leipzig against the above-mentioned writing. I regret only that it smacks too strongly of the partiality and injustice of its author, and that the latter has revealed in it only too clearly how little he knows the true basis of music and its real beauty." Okay, so some unfounded comments there, clearly. But then he goes on to defend his use of the word musikanten. And of course he says that, look, musikanten shouldn't be ashamed to take themselves for what they really are. He says they wish to cultivate music and make a name for themselves, thus earn fame, honor, money, and their daily bread. And yet, what folly! They do not wish to be called musikanten. According to this, a philosopher would have to be ashamed to bear the name of his science. A lawyer would also have to discard his title, and in the end, new titles would have to be found in all the branches of learning to indicate what and who the people are who cultivate them. His response here is only a few paragraphs. You see that it doesn't run quite as deep as Birnbaum's own rebuttal. Lawrence Christoph Mizler, the famous Mizler Society of Musical Sciences that Bach became a member of later, Mizler decides to join the defenders of Bach, and he writes a few paragraphs on how, no, you really can't use the term musikanten here. This is completely inaccurate, it's unjust, and your response in defending musikanten doesn't even make any sense, right? Now, one would think Scheibe would give up here at this point, but he goes further, and this is really where it gets a bit ridiculous. He writes to his own magazine under the pen name of Cornelius, and he pretends to be Bach, or he pretends to be, at least according to him, a satire of all different composers. Now, his satire begins like this: "My dear sir, I am one of those musikanten who have striven with the greatest care to achieve extreme facility in playing an instrument and an admirable ability at composing in the most intricate style. I could prove by the testimony of not only all the inhabitants in the town that has the honor to contain me within its walls, but also of all the chiefs of the musical capellan in the surrounding villages and hamlets, that I am the greatest of artists, on all the cittern, and that, over and above this, I compose so intricately and wonderfully that listening to my pieces makes people quite bewildered. Everything is intermingled. Everything is so completely worked out that one cannot tell one voice from the other, nor can one ever recognize the principal melody or understand the words. Let it be said, however, that to anyone who would make bold to find fault with my ability, to cast doubts upon my merits, or in any way to belittle my fame that I am the greatest citterist and the greatest composer in the world, it is certain that if I lived in the time of the ancient Greeks, who our writers praise so highly in their papers, that I should be remembered with greater fame than any of the ancient philosophers and musikanten. You now know who I am, and with whom you have to deal. He goes on a bit later. Since, however, as I have firmly convinced myself that I am undoubtedly the greatest artist in music, I cannot forbear to warn you that you are in the future not to make bold to find fault with me, or to condemn or make ridiculous the manifold counterpoints, canons, circular songs, and all the other intricate forms of musical writing that, as I have found, you have perversely called turgid. All these things are particularly close to my heart, and my greatest pleasure and joy come when I have made a piece in which I have introduced, if not all, at least most of these artifices. What good are those bare songs that can be understood at once and remembered and sung from memory? I reserve my praise for a piece in which everything is finely intermingled, that the listener is astonished and cannot conceive what variegated curlicues everything is interwoven with everything else, since no melody and in fact nothing can be remembered. These are the true masterpieces. In them one may recognize a composer. Shame on you, sir, that you once attacked such remarkable works of art, and do not make bold to express any longer your false and annoying opinion, or to maintain it, or to go so far as use it to belittle me, for I assure you that I will not let such an insult stand. Though I cannot write against you myself, I will persuade one of my good friends to defend me against you. The learned man is now writing you this letter according to all my indications and ideas, and will protect me against you, you may be sure. Don't let things come to that, for you might very easily rue it. I am a man of my word. Scheibe signs this satire under the name Cornelius, and he adds insult to injury by dating the letter December 30th, 1737, a few months before Birnbaum's criticism, as if to show, look, he says, I'm not going to defend myself, but I'm going to send someone else to do it, and he's referencing Birnbaum's letter. Now, this, for all intents and purposes, is where the controversy ends. However, it isn't really where it ends, because just as Birnbaum had printed out in full Scheibe's criticism and picked it apart line by line and absolutely destroyed it, Scheibe then has the gall to print out Birnbaum's defense in full and adds 164 polemic footnotes. And we will not go so far as to get into that, but let's just end the episode here. What do you think of all this? Not who's right, but whose side are you on? Do you sympathize? Do you at least feel a little bad that Scheibe went down so hard, or do you think that he deserved it? Did he deserve this place in musical history for not signing his name in his initial attack of our man in question here? Let me know. Keep the discussion going. Leave some comments on the Substack. And I know there hasn't been any music, so here is a little taste of what is to come in a forthcoming episode, and I will see you soon. Thanks for listening.
This is WTF Bach. Donate on PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo. Share this podcast with your frenemies. Wow, that's fabulous.